This session on your program is entitled Issues That Our Schools Are Facing. It's our intention to depress the heck out of you and then see if we can improve things by the end of the day. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I didn't say that. Now, you'll notice that we have 3 people back up here now for this session, and what we'll do is allow time for questions and answers after all 3 have had a chance to speak. And so we'll try to hold them to a time limit so that we can move through there. You'll notice that there are some standing mics here in the various parts of the room, so you'll have a chance to be able to step up to those mics and ask questions. But we thought what we would do is actually cover all 3 topics at once before we did so. So that's the plan. So let me begin by introducing Tom Burns. He's our district superintendent for the St. Lawrence and Lewis County BOCES. And for those of you who may not know or understand about BOCES, that stands for the Board of Cooperative Educational Services, which coordinates a lot of different services to the public schools throughout our, basically our county. Tom?
Thank you, Jim. Thanks to St. Lawrence University and Ben Dixon and the Burt family, Bill Fox. Always a great host here at St. Lawrence, and appreciate being here. As Jim pointed out, I think my role will be to depress everyone, and then we can maybe talk about some solution-oriented things this afternoon. Looking at the crowd today, and I know many of you, this was set up as a primer in terms of school funding, so we will try to keep it simple. I just want to acknowledge Dick Ashlaw is here on behalf of Senator Griffo, and so I just want to forewarn Dick. I will make some statements about the state legislature this morning, but they're not intended in any way, shape, or form towards Senator Griffo, Dick. This is one of these phenomena. It's true with state legislators and school districts. I've seen various polls. When you ask people about public education in general or legislatures in general, they have a very negative opinion, but they very much like their own school or their own legislator. So that's the analogy I will put to that. So talking about school funding, I do have some slides that I'll show you in a moment, but I think in a nutshell, our schools are funded basically with a pot of monies that comes from state aid on the one hand and local property taxes on the other. This is measured, and you will see in the slides, and you may see this in the newspaper, there's a term called combined wealth ratio, CWR. And basically the CWR is a formula that captures all of the income and the property wealth in a school district. I have no idea how the state education department and the legislature gather this data. It's a very complex formula. What I do know is that the combined wealth ratio, the average for all school districts in this state is 1.0. Of the 18 component school districts we have in the region, we have 2 of the 18 that have a combined wealth ratio slightly over 1.0. So it gives you an indication, and we actually have school districts that are below 0.3. So many of our school districts, in fact, are below 0.5 in terms of, again, their income and their property wealth. There are a number of reasons and factors that are affecting our schools. I was here several years ago and was talking about consolidation and regionalization, and that was really even before the financial crisis set in, because what we were experiencing then were a period of significant enrollment declines. So this goes back to the financial picture because state aid is based on a per pupil allotment. So if we don't have kids, we're going to lag behind in terms of state revenues. So since the 1976-77 school year, this region has lost over 10,000 students. We were over 26,000. We're now just over 16,000 students. So that is obviously having a financial impact. I just wanted to talk a little bit before I start in with our slides in terms of the taxing entities. As you know, the local municipalities, towns, villages, et cetera, handle both the assessment of properties and the equalization rates. So this further complicates the problems that when school districts go to levy taxes, they had really nothing to do with the assessment or the equalization, setting of equalization rates. There was an interesting article, if you have ever heard of Mark Tucker. He's the executive director of the National Center on Education and the Economy. His website is www.ncee.org. Dr. Tucker has some very interesting thoughts on the subject, and in a recent article in The Atlantic, he actually compared low wealth and high wealth school districts, and the data that he used, and essentially the assertion he was making, is that in high wealth school districts, wealthy people can actually form their own distinct school tax districts, and they're very exclusionary in nature. And although the amount of taxes that individuals may pay in those high wealth school districts, their tax rates are actually very low. So this is something that we are seeing in New York State. Unfortunately, it's not just an upstate, downstate phenomena, but it is definitely a low wealth, high wealth issue. We also have the concept of mandate relief. I think in New York State, our schools and in this region are overburdened with mandates. The one that I will throw out there is special education. In New York State, the state legislature over the past 4 or 5 decades has added 200 plus additional mandates on top of the federal IDEA requirements. There are some states in the country that actually adhere only to the IDEA requirements. They have no additional mandates. So that is one area. I guess if there is hope here and optimism, the New York State Council of School Superintendents estimated that just fixing the special education problem alone would eliminate the financial crisis that the schools are facing. That's just one area in terms of mandate relief that we could look at. Other items that schools are struggling with, and again, you've read about these, you won't be surprised. We did have the program on energy and utilities, and some districts are looking at wood chip boilers and trying to address that. Basically, retirement and pension costs, health insurance, salary and benefits, and contractual issues. I think there are many school board members and some of our superintendents in the room, and I think what may surprise them when they become part of the school board governance team and they actually sit down to start working with the budget is they realize at the end of that process, after you've gone through it a few times, that maybe 25 to 35% of that budget is actually within the field of play. All these other costs that I just listed are set. Certainly salary and benefits. And I did want to talk about contractual issues a bit, just because you hear the governor talk about his skill and his success as a negotiator, and you often hear him say he would like other entities to follow his lead. What I would tell you is that, school districts in the North Country are engaging in those sorts of negotiations. But the contractual labor laws, again, were written 40, 50, 60 years ago. So I would tell you that we're maybe dealing with an antiquated set of structures to begin those conversations. That kind of leads into another thought, which is the idea that demographics is destiny and that we can't ignore that. Mickey Miller is here, who's president of the Madrid-Waddington School Board, and they had a community breakfast several weeks ago that I attended where their superintendent put up on the screen that Madrid-Waddington had approximately 120 or so school employees, and right now they have actually almost the same number of retirees. So again, this is another demographic that's changed in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, where several decades ago, school districts probably had 2 to 3 active employees per every retiree. In the North Country, we're now reaching a state of equilibrium and moving forward as the baby boomers exit stage right, we'll be looking at having actually more retirees that we're funding on the books than active employees. So I just want to show you, and I want to give my thanks to Rick Timms, who is Executive Director of the Statewide School Finance Consortium, who put these together, and just wanted to talk to you a bit in terms of, is the state aid that the school is receiving, is it sufficient and is it equitable? And Rick has some fairly complicated scatter plots, and again, I'm not going to go through these in detail. What you see here is the bottom category, gap elimination adjustment. And let me see, these were the total aids in billions of dollars, so about $20 billion annually that's given out to school districts. Now, the previous slide, you see, no, showed the gap elimination adjustment. Okay, here it is. In terms of the state aid, the gap elimination adjustment, so this is this artificial mechanism that the governor essentially used to close the state budget gap, 14.4% of the total monies that were contained in the foundation aid. So I think at the end of the day, the story here is, you know, we still do get state aid, but a good share of that is taken back through the GEA. So what is provided in state aid, the governor taketh away. And so this is the last few years. You can see that percentage in red down at the bottom. And so you do hear the governor saying each year, this is what you got in state aid. You really shouldn't be complaining. But he never mentions this part of it, that we don't really see all those monies. So the total for 3 years of GEA takebacks, $6 billion, when about $20 billion is being spent statewide. And I'm not going to conjecture here. I'm not going to say, is the $20 billion annually? I mean, I mentioned special ed. I've mentioned variation between low wealth, high wealth districts. So I'm not making a statement about, is the $20 billion statewide enough? It probably is. But of course, the distribution and in terms of all these mechanisms, it complicates it for North Country schools. Okay, and Rick has some other indicators here. Again, let me see what he's trying to show. The percent change on the far right, about 4.7 in total state aid. But again, I think you need to think about the figure at the bottom, that even though the governor says we're getting a 4% increase in state aid, that all of those GEA monies were taken back. Okay, and after 4 years, it's estimated to be about $8.4 billion that the state has taken back. Okay, this is what's happened to state aid per pupil. And this basically shows the poorest districts, how much state aid they receive as compared to the wealthiest, 13,422 versus the wealthiest districts, about 1,600 in terms of state aid per pupil. And then the combined wealth ratios so that you can see those for each district. I think what Dr. Timms is trying to show here is when you look at the red line on top, if you just took this assumption and you said, well, the poorest districts are receiving $13,000 in state aid and the wealthiest $1,600, you would assume that was fair. But when you see the text on the right-hand side, what you'll see is that the ratio doesn't quite add up. And I'll just give you a minute to read that text box on the far right. The problem is that the formula, as you can see, is so complicated that I think you have Rick Timms and you have a handful of people at Division of Budget and some people actually on the legislative staff, Senate Finance, some other folks that have been very helpful to us who actually understand this, who can take all these numbers and go into a back room and figure all of this out. So it's very difficult. It does become convoluted by politics. Pat Brady, Bill Gregory, Steve Putman, and I met with Division of Budget a couple of years ago. Great staff, Lisa Timoney, who I think does do a lot of the metrics here. But they were very candid with us. They told us that when they put the formula together, they do the runs and they see what the aid per district will be, and then they meet with the legislators, and let's just say I think the formula becomes corrupted in certain ways to achieve certain results. And this is just another graphic representation. I mentioned CWR earlier, so this is basically shows all the districts in the state on the scatter plot and the relationship between their wealth, their CWR, and the amount of GEA restoration. And again, you can see the majority there in the middle of the scatter plot and what their CWR is. Okay, and I think what Dr. Timms wants to demonstrate with the red arrow here is that mass of school districts, given their poverty, needs to receive more funding and be pushed out into the center of that graph. Okay, so he's indicating it actually should, the scatter plot should be somewhere in that neighborhood. So I mean, I don't think any of us as local school districts have certainly the time or the resources or the capacity. Luckily, we do have groups like the Rural Schools Association. You'll hear from Dr. Sipple later, people like Rick Timms, et cetera. We've got a handful of people and some groups that we can rely on to break these numbers down to this degree to see that, to ensure that North Country districts are receiving what might be considered their fair share of state monies. Okay. And I think I have over-exhausted my time, I'm sure, and I have to give my cohort, Steve Todd, a little time to brighten your day and talk about curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That'll be a part of the quiz at 11:30. Yeah, exactly. So let me introduce Steve Todd, who is the Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum for the St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES. And I'll just add parenthetically that both Tom and Steve are graduates of St. Lawrence University.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Ben. And thank you, Tom. I do get to talk with you about something that's perhaps a little less depressing than what Tom talked about. So we sometimes do the good cop, bad cop routine, and I'm thankful that I get to be the good cop today, I guess, to some extent. Not that it's all happy news in curriculum. As you know, it's a time of great stress and strain with all of the change that's taking place with the Regents' reform agenda and under great financial strain. But I think in general, the concepts that we'll be touching upon here are a little more upbeat than the financial stresses and concepts. In just the few minutes that we'll be talking here, I want to do about a 10,000-foot flyover for you of 4 major trends in curriculum, some of which relate to the entire state, some of which I'd like to look at from a regional focus. And then certainly in the Q&A portion of it, if there are elements of this you'd like to look at from a little bit closer to the ground, a little more granular level, please let's engage in that. The first piece I'd like to touch upon is the new Common Core standards and the major instructional shifts that are taking place around the state and around the nation relating to the new standards and the new ways of teaching that will allow our students to be college and career ready. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about career and technical education from a regional point of view, where we stand and what some of our programs look like. Some of you may be quite familiar with the career and technical ed programs that we have at St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES. Some may be less familiar, so I'd like to very quickly touch upon the different types of programming we have. Third, to touch a little bit upon secondary and post-secondary partnerships, which I think is a huge opportunity for us, and some of what's already going on, and maybe we can brainstorm about some future options moving forward. And then finally, just a quick touch upon the Multiple Pathways Initiative, which is, we think, a very promising concept right now that's at the level of the Board of Regents and State Education Department, and we have very high hopes for the potential that this concept might offer in helping us to help all of our students to be college and career ready. So let me briefly touch upon the Common Core, which I'm sure many of you have heard either a little about or a lot about, but it's difficult not to hear some, at least lately, in regard to the way the assessments, the new assessments that Jim pointed out are starting this week in New York State based upon the Common Core. Great deal of stress, great deal of concern and anxiety. But the Common Core itself is an initiative that began with the National Governors Association. It wasn't a New York State initiative exclusively, and it really wasn't something that came from the State Education Department or the Federal Education Department. It was the National Governors Association. And as of today, 45 states, plus the District of Columbia, have adopted the Common Core standards as the measure of what we'll be expecting our students to know and do moving forward. And the focus on that, of course, is college and career readiness. And again, from that 10,000-foot flyover view, the bottom line, for many of you in secondary or in post-secondary education, I think what we all have to acknowledge is there have been too many kids graduating from high school who didn't have the skills and competencies that they needed to be successful either in college when they started the next year or years later, or in the workforce. If you look at some institutions of higher learning, particularly two-year schools, it's not uncommon to see more than half of the students entering in their first year there needing to take non-credit-bearing courses because their reading and their writing and their mathematical foundational skills weren't up to speed. Now, that's something that's not sustainable, and that's not fair to them. It's not sustainable for our colleges. It's not preparing people for the workforce. And it's placing an incredible strain on families and students and colleges. And it's something that I think we all have needed to look at and step back and say, okay, how do we back map from where we need kids to be when they get out of school? Whether they're going into the workforce or whether they're going into a 2-year institution or a 4-year institution, whatever they're choosing to do. How do we figure out what they need to know at that commencement level and then map it backward all the way to pre-K? And that's really what the Common Core is all about and why it's been embraced by so many states. So if we look at what's different, on the English language arts side, and really the major differences at this point that we would look at are on English language arts and mathematics. On the ELA side of things, the major difference is that we need students to be able to read whatever they are reading and understand it and be able to find evidence in it, whether they're going on to college or whether they're working on a technical manual later in life to know how to fix an automobile, or whether they're reading their own owner's manual in their car, or whether they're doing their taxes, to be able to read and understand what they're reading and be able to cite evidence in what they're reading to make a meaningful argument, but also to be able to do whatever they need to do with that text. So it relates to deep reading and understanding what you're reading and having the foundational vocabulary skills to be able to move forward and do something with that. On the mathematical side, plain and simple, we've been teaching kids a lot, but we've been teaching it a mile wide and an inch deep, so that when kids moved from grade to grade and then from institution to institution, many of them have not had the basic foundational skills to be successful at the next level because, say, at third grade, we said, oh my God, we've got to cover 75 topics here, and I've got to move on to the next topic. Well, what the Common Core says is at each level, let's figure out what kids, again, back mapping from what they have to know to be successful at the end, backwards to pre-K. What do kids really, really need to be good at before they move on to the next? And what we really find is in the early primary grades, making sure they really, really understand numbers. And knowing then after that they know how to really add, subtract, multiply, divide. Knowing in 5th and 6th grade that they really deeply understand fractions before they move on to algebra, before they then move on to geometry and trigonometry and calculus. But all too often, we've had too many kids who have had a mile-wide, inch-deep exposure to mathematics, and what the Common Core does is it narrows the focus. So again, what it relates to is we have the standards, and you'll sometimes hear criticism from folks that with the Common Core, now I'm being told exactly what I have to teach, and it's becoming too programmed, and it's becoming too prescriptive. I guess I would make a slightly alternate argument on that. In the Common Core, what we have are standards that speak to what a student needs to be able to do and know. And from the state of New York, thankfully, we have a degree of detail and specificity in some suggested curricular materials that can help us to get there, that in my 20 years in education, I've not seen before. And many folks who've been in education for a lot longer than me have said the same thing, that we've always had standards. We had the 2005 standards, and before that we had other standards, but we haven't had detailed, suggested curricular materials that allow teachers to not spend all of their time developing new materials. So districts and buildings and teachers still have a lot of freedom in choosing how they teach and what methods and strategies they use to get students to the level that the standards speak to. But thankfully, we have some options from the state in terms of curriculum modules and documents that are more detailed and more helpful than things we've had before. But really, it's the shifts in instruction that it's all about. Not getting down to the granular level of exactly what the curriculum map says on every moment and every day, but seeing big picture when we back up. When you see a classroom where there's Common Core instruction deeply ingrained, we see that there are students who are reading more difficult texts. We're seeing that it's not just fiction, but it's a nice balance of fiction and nonfiction. One thing that we've noticed is that over the years we've perhaps reached an imbalance, and because in some cases we've enjoyed reading fiction, we've read it exclusively to the exclusion of nonfiction, so that when kids got to the higher grades where they were expected to be able to extract from their social studies texts or from their science texts or from college textbooks or from their technical manual critical information, they didn't have the practice and experience reading things other than fiction. So what the major shifts in instruction we see from the Common Core speak to is making sure there's that nice balance between informational text and narrative text, but also making sure that students are able to discern an argument and cite evidence in whatever piece of literature they're looking at to support that. So it's not just saying, what is your opinion about a particular idea? It's make a cogent argument about some topic and go back to this text or texts and find me evidence that shows me why you believe that. Or, and you could support either way, but find evidence in there. It's the kind of skill and the kind of competency that's going to serve students well regardless of what they do, whether they're going to college or into the workforce. And so, and obviously being able to verbalize and being able to write about all of these things and having the academic vocabulary that'll prepare them for the next level, whatever they do. If we look at the mathematical side of things, again, fewer topics at any given time with great depth, and making sure that if a student gets to the end of a lesson and they say, teacher, I don't understand, it's not just a question of showing them the same algorithm again and 5 examples of it. It's showing them 5 different ways to get that same answer, or better yet, and here's where the beauty of the Common Core comes in, helping the students themselves to discover those ways. And it really dovetails beautifully with constructivist education, and I give a tip of my hat to Jim Schumann and to Don Mezeboff and all of our friends at the Constructivist Conference and our partners here at St. Lawrence University in that conference, that constructivism fits beautifully with the Common Core, because really, ultimately, when at the end of the day, what it's teaching us is we need to help students to be able to construct and create their own understanding and their own knowledge, whether it's from the texts they're reading or the activities they're engaged in, or on the mathematical side, being able to envision and act upon 5 or 10 different possible ways to get the right answer instead of just, this is the algorithm that I taught you, and you're not going to get credit for it because you didn't do it the way I taught you to do it. Yeah, you got the right answer, but you did it the wrong way. Common Core gets away from that. So are there lots of possible criticisms of the speed with which we've moved on this and the speed with which assessments have been implemented and maybe the speed with which we've moved to a very high level of expectation in those assessments? Absolutely. And I think all of us would acknowledge that. But what I think ultimately the Common Core and the assessments that measure Common Core instruction are trying to get us to is a point where the students are graduating from one level to the next with the skills they need to ultimately, when they leave high school, be college and career ready, because they're going to know their math inside and out and sideways. They're going to know in all of their subjects how to read what they're reading and support and support arguments, extract information, make arguments, build their own knowledge in a constructivist fashion. It's, I think, in many ways very, very powerful and very, very useful. And certainly the most, I think, compelling argument we're hearing right now in public, and I'm sure you've heard, is why do we need to move so quickly? It's placing a great deal of stress on our kids and on our teachers and on our institutions. And I think we'd all acknowledge that we've moved with breathtaking speed. Kids are taking tests this week on curricula that are really in process. There really is no school in the state of New York that has fully implemented the Common Core, even those who are the most progressive and have moved the most quickly. We are in process. And so there's a great deal of stress across the nation and across the state and in our region. I guess